the story begins with a shoe that did not belong where it was found. Small items are often the most honest witnesses to chaos. And on a late June morning in 1863, a single Confederate boot quietly ended up in the streets of Gettysburg. That misplaced shoe would ripple through decisions and movements that no general could have predicted. Confederate soldiers were not supposed to be marching through sleepy Pennsylvania towns. The Army of Northern Virginia was deep into enemy territory, driven by supply needs, strategic aims, and a sense of momentum that can make even unlikely decisions seem rational. Shoes, more than glory, became a currency of survival for men whose boots were worn thin by months of campaigning. Armies march on their feet, and feet need shoes to keep moving through hard campaigns. Confederate logistics were fragile and desperate, with supply lines stretched thin and commissaries unable to meet basic demand for footwear. Commanders tolerated foraging for necessities, but they never anticipated how a personal search for shoes would steer the Army's path toward Gettysburg. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, sat at a crossroads of country roads and rail lines that suddenly mattered to armies on the move. The town's location made it a magnet for foraging parties looking for supplies, including the all-important boots that soldiers needed. It was here that a simple search for shoes intersected with larger strategic movements in a way no one expected. A Confederate detachment entered Gettysburg hoping to find shoes and provisions, not to start a major engagement. Their scouting parties were cautious, moving house to house and barn to barn in the hope of replenishing weary troops, instead of returning quietly with sacks of shoes. They bumped into Union cavalry, who were investigating the same town for different reasons. This chance encounter escalated quickly from suspicion to firefight within a matter of hours. Small skirmishes rapidly attracted reinforcements on both sides, because commanders assumed that significant enemy forces were nearby. What began as a search for shoes turned into the opening moves of a battle neither army had fully planned for at that location. By the afternoon, messages flew along command lines faster than leaders could verify facts on the ground. Generals interpreted the clash as evidence of a larger engagement and pushed troops toward Gettysburg to gain advantage. Those decisions, made under pressure and imperfect information, set the stage for 3 days that would become the most famous of the Civil War. The first day of fighting was chaotic and inconclusive, marked by confusion and local initiative. More than grand strategy, Union and Confederate units collided on roads, farms, and ridges, without clear plans designed for the terrain they suddenly occupied. Men fought in fragmented ways because command structures were reacting to an unfolding situation rather than directing a premeditated battle. On the second day, commanders sought to seize the tactical high ground that defined the struggle at Gettysburg. Hills and ridges such as Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge became linchpins for both sides. Because they offered commanding views and fields of fire, control of these positions required brutal infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, and decisive leadership under fire. Little Round Top became emblematic of the desperate fighting that would characterize the second day. Union defenders grasped the knoll's importance and held it at enormous cost through determined counterattacks. The ability of small units and individual officers to adapt on the spot would prove decisive in a way no one could have predicted when that missing shoe first drew soldiers into town. On the third day, General Lee gambled on a mass infantry assault that would decide the battle and perhaps the war. The infamous charge led by Pickett became a test of will, discipline, and the brutal realities of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. It was a moment where timing, terrain, and sheer human courage collided in a way that defined the battle's legacy forever. Pickett's charge failed not because the men lacked valor, but because the tactical odds were brutally stacked against them. Union artillery and concentrated musketry tore into advancing ranks as the attackers crossed open ground. The utter human cost of those minutes crystallized the turning point. Many historians identify with Gettysburg's end of offensive Confederate momentum. The casualty figures after 3 days shocked contemporaries and reshaped political calculations in the nation. Tens of thousands of men were killed, wounded, or missing, leaving communities across America to reckon with unbearable losses. The scale of sacrifice made Gettysburg more than a military event. It became a moral and political turning point in the war's narrative. The Confederate retreat that followed was as consequential as the charge that preceded it. Lee's northern offensive effectively ended with the Army's withdrawal, altering strategic momentum in favor of the Union. That shift would reverberate through subsequent campaigns and into the political sphere where public support and international perception mattered intensely. Politically, Gettysburg helped bolster Northern morale and gave President Lincoln room to refocus war aims. The Union victory enabled a clearer articulation of the war's moral purpose, culminating months later in a short but profound address at the battlefield. The speech reframed the conflict as a struggle for a unified nation committed to equality and liberty, altering the war's symbolic direction. But none of that grand meaning existed on the morning a shoe was found on Gettysburg streets. For the soldiers who first pushed into town, the goal was simple survival and basic supply replenishment. The irony that such a mundane object could funnel strategic choices and human lives into a single historic event is unmistakable and chilling. Small events have always nudged large outcomes in military history, and Gettysburg offers one of the clearest examples. A single logistical need, a misinterpreted skirmish, and a series of reactive decisions converged into a titanic clash. Understanding this chain helps explain why history often hinges on human contingencies rather than grand designs alone. Historical contingency does not absolve leaders or destiny from responsibility, but it changes how we narrate outcomes. Gettysburg was both planned and accidental, heroic and tragic, strategic and chaotic, because human choices were embedded in uncertainty. Recognizing the messy, contingent nature of the battle deepens our understanding of how wars are really fought and won. The legacy of Gettysburg extends beyond casualty counts and battlefield monuments, because it reshaped national identity. The battlefield became a place of memory where political meaning was layered on top of personal loss. Over time, those layers created a narrative about sacrifice, unity, and the moral stakes of national survival that persists in American culture. Tourists and school children standing on the ground where men fought bring their own perspectives to history's actors. For many visitors, monuments represent closure, honor, and commemoration, rather than the messy reality of blood and smoke. The way communities remember Gettysburg shows how societies choose to frame and integrate traumatic events into collective identity. Gettysburg also shaped military doctrine for future generations because it illustrated the lethal combination of terrain and firepower. Commanders learned hard lessons about frontal assaults, coordination, and reconnaissance that influenced subsequent wars. Those lessons were paid for with lives, and the battlefield became a classroom for military thinkers determined to avoid similar mistakes. The missing shoe remains a small object in a vast story, but it symbolizes how fragile plans can be in the face of human needs. Shoes represented warmth, mobility, and survival for soldiers whose lives depended on them, and that basic need helped redirect a campaign. When we zoom out from grand strategy to the human scale, history becomes less inevitable and more contingent on tiny, stubborn facts. There are many what-ifs in Gettysburg scholarship that start with that morning when soldiers sought footwear. What if the shoe had been found somewhere else, or not at all? And what if skirmishers had not clashed there, because different orders had been given? Those counterfactuals remind us that history is a web of possibilities, often hinging on trivial-seeming details. Yet, destiny does not solely ride on chance. Leadership choices amplified the effects of that initial encounter. The way commanders read the battlefield, committed reserves, and chose objectives turned a local altercation into a national turning point. Gettysburg, therefore, stands as both an accident of human need and a product of deliberate military and political decisions. In the end, Gettysburg is a lesson about scale, contingency, and memory that matters today, as much as ever. Small choices rapidly compound into historical consequences. When systems are stressed and uncertainty is high, whether in war, politics, or technology. Understanding that dynamic gives us humility about predictions and greater attention to the human factors that truly shape events. The battlefield's silence now invites reflection on what was lost and what was preserved in memory. Names carved into stone and speeches delivered years later attempt to settle the chaos into meaning. But the ground itself resists simple explanations. Gettysburg forces us to reckon with paradox. Accidental origins produce profound consequences, and messy human reality created lasting national myth. If the missing shoe teaches one lasting principle, it is that history is often a collage of the planned and the accidental. The strategic and the mundane collide in ways that decision makers cannot always predict, and ordinary people on the ground often determine outcomes. A single artifact can therefore carry disproportionate weight in the story of a nation when circumstances align. Gettysburg is not only the story of generals and tactics, it is also the story of a town, a shoe, and the soldiers who wanted to keep walking. Those human elements connect us to the past more honestly than strategy alone ever could, and they remind us that history belongs to ordinary people and their small consequential acts. Remembering that gives the past texture and makes its lessons useful for our uncertain present. So when you visit a battlefield or read a history book, look for the small things that might have redirected the story. The missing shoe at Gettysburg is a cautionary emblem of how tiny everyday needs can steer nations and decide fates. History, when examined closely, becomes less about inevitability and more about fragile human choices that added up to something monumental. If this perspective changed how you think about history and cause and effect, consider following the story into other moments where small things mattered greatly. The missing shoe at Gettysburg is a doorway into a broader understanding of contingency, responsibility, and memory across conflicts and crises. If this gave you a new perspective on the past, hit subscribe to explore more untold histories and surprising turning points.